Okay. And we are actually live. Hey, there we go. All right, it's popped up. It looks like we're in. Thanks for joining me today, folks. If you're out there on YouTube today during this presentation, please jump on in, leave a comment, let me know you're watching. I know it is super late at night, so I don't expect anyone to watch it live, but I do like recording these presentations live, in part because it keeps me honest about what I'm saying, and it's natural as well, and also because I would start and stop a billion times if I didn't do it live and be forced to keep going. So thanks for joining me today. Today it's a week 6 video presentation on core components of acceptance and commitment therapy. So this is really cool stuff. I don't know that I've ever covered this on my channel before. And so we're going to jump into it. We get some core principles today, and then we're also looking at a couple of research articles. So just to go through all that real quickly here, we'll do a quick introduction to ACT and the Hexaflex. We'll go over the presentation there, and then we'll jump into looking at these 2 interventions. It's really neat. One came from China, one came from UK, and the Chinese approach took an app-based intervention, and then the UK approach did a 4-week in-workplace intervention, and they both approached things a little differently, contacted certain parts of the Hexaflex a little more than others, and had different results from it, so it's really interesting to see how that works. So we're going to look into all of that today. Let's jump right in first to the Hexaflex. If you're familiar with the Hexaflex, this should be a quick review, but if you're not, let's just a quick overview. We'll jump in here with acceptance. Okay, acceptance is an idea that we're opening up. Okay, so with this, you can imagine the world is full of good things and wonderful things. That's great, and we want those things, and often we can kind of try to push everything else away and not experience that. But the truth is that if you could control everything in the universe and make everything perfect and good all the time, you would. And the fact that it's not always perfect and wonderful means it's not really something you can control. Instead of fighting and resisting all these things that we can't actually fight or resist, it's an approach, an act to open up yourself to accept the fact that there are going to be bad things that happen, and that's okay. It's a part of life. And things will come and go in their time, and that we can accept that that's the way that our lives are, and that's how the world works. Moving from acceptance, we'll go around the circle counterclockwise here. Well, the hexaflex, it's a hexagon, right? And it's about psychological flexibility, so hexaflex. Let's flex on down to diffusion. In diffusion, we're looking at this idea of stepping back. And there's a lot of good metaphors for this, but I like to think of the idea that we're stepping back from our thoughts, and instead of holding on to them real tightly, we're kind of letting it go, and we're taking a look from the outside of our own thoughts in. Instead of being tangled up in it, we can see our thoughts for what they are, and that lets us react based on how we would like to react instead of letting those thoughts in the moment control us. And that gives us a lot of freedom and psychological flexibility. As we go around the Hexaflex, yet another turn, self as context. It has a lot of similarities to diffusion from the way I often look at it. But you can think of self as context as the noticing self, or it's the part of you that notices the things that you're doing and thinking and can observe yourself. And then it works very well with the idea of diffusion, because you're stepping back and you're observing. And what are you observing? You're observing that things might not be going the way you want, and maybe they could, and maybe you have some options, and accepting that. See, it all connects together. Now, what should we accept? What should we do when we have this this vision of ourselves? We can continue on. Actually, I'm going to jump across to the top. Attention to the present moment, or contact with the present moment, is the way the course textbook for our class uses that, and I like that as well. And the idea is that you're focusing on what's right in front of you in that moment, and you're not being pulled away into the past or the unknown future. You're focusing on the here and now. Be here right now. And you can think about that as like you're consciously paying attention to the world around you. I like this idea personally because for me it means that I can make the choice to do something now. I can choose to behave in this present moment. I can't choose to behave in a future that may or may not occur. I can't change any choices that occurred in the past. So if I'm going to really have some flexibility to interact with my life in a way that'll be helpful to me, in that present moment is where that decision can be made. And so refocusing yourself to where you are in the present moment instead of being lost in the million potential futures or in any regrets from the past, being in the present moment, accepting the reality that's around you, being able to watch your thinking through diffusion and notice how you're doing with yourself as context. These ideas come together and are and bringing out ideas of mindfulness for us, and that really helps with psychological flexibility. Now, once we're in this wonderful situation, what do we do with that? And that comes to these last 2 points of the Hexaflex. We look at our values. What's important to us? What really matters for us? Our course textbook says, what do you want to stand for in life? And I think that that's an important thing for everybody. We want to know what we stand for, because when we know what we're aiming at with our values, we can take committed action towards those values, and then that's something that'll be meaningful. And inside all of these 6 items in the Hexaflex, that really gives us an opportunity to get out of being stuck in a rigid pattern of reacting to and trying to get away from these negative, terrible things, and opens us up to more options on how can I go forward in a way that will be good in relationship to what I value. So that's the idea behind the Hexaflex, and it's kind of the core idea for ACT. I really do like the idea that there's some core, even more foundational principles outside the Hexaflex that we can look at, as some of the speakers in our class have been able to talk about. But at this point, let's take a look in the context of the Hexaflex, because it is really common and well supported in the field. And we'll go on and look at these 2 interventions in the context of this Hexaflex. So the purpose of the presentation, obviously, is to look at these 2 articles. We've got Liu et al. And Prudenzi et al. Liu et al. Is looking at the effects and mechanisms of a web and mobile-based acceptance and commitment therapy intervention for anxiety and depression symptoms in nurses, which is pretty cool. They focus more on anxiety and depression as their key targets, although they looked at a few other things as well. And then Prudenzi et al. We're working on a workplace acceptance and commitment therapy intervention for improving healthcare staff psychological distress. And so they had a whole list of things they're looking at, but the key focus for them was psychological distress. So let's jump in and take a look at them. First, the Liu et al. Article, using that web and mobile-based acceptance and commitment therapy intervention. So they did a group study. They pulled active duty nurses from China. They had, I can't remember the exact number. It was about 140 different nurses in China. I think it might be 145. And so they did an app-based intervention. So I'm not familiar with all the Chinese apps, but according to the researchers, they put it out on this app that's freely available and publicly used by pretty much everybody in the healthcare system in China. So all of their participants were familiar with it and had used it before and had experience with this app. And the assignment for the app was to view the video instruction, and I don't think it was all video, but view the instructions that went through the ACT concepts. And so they went through and discussed and taught the concepts. Actually, they used the course textbook that we have, the Harris book, as one of the sources to make the information. They also used one of Stephen Hayes' books as well. And they created these instructional videos, completed over 5 weeks. And then they also had a homework component where they were supposed to complete mindfulness activities at home outside of their sessions in the app. So everybody was involved in that. They went through all these core concepts of ACT. The Hexaflex concepts were discussed, and then they were expected to do the mindfulness activities at home. One key component that'll come up on the results page here, but they were not monitored in doing the mindfulness activities, so they don't know if they actually did them or not, and they weren't necessarily required to, even though they were encouraged to. So possibly the mindfulness activities didn't actually occur. After the 5 weeks of app intervention were completed, there was a week 6 follow-up to see if the change is maintained. So the results were, well, a significant reduction in anxiety and depression. Now, this was a group study, so they did statistical analysis, so it's not single subject design like we in ABA and behavior analysis tend to prefer. But it was done with a large group and showed, using some standardized metric tools, that anxiety and depression were significantly reduced. They also wanted to look at sleep quality, burnout, and work performance. There was some improvement in those, but not as much. And then also they did a test to check on the impact of the mindfulness exercises, and it looked like they didn't really have much of an effect at all, which the researchers identified that's pretty different from typically like past research, but they acknowledged that they may not have controlled well for that in the study because the participants were not required to complete their homework with that. So that's the Liu et al. Article. Let's quickly look at the Prudenzi article as well, and then we can compare them. So this also was a group study, also healthcare workers. It was specifically nurses in the Chinese study. In the UK study, it was open to anyone who worked for the HSA, which is the Health Services Administration. I'm not sure exactly, but it's the government healthcare system. I'm not sure the actual acronym. They offered group session-based interventions. They were in a direct group training session, maximum about 10 people. I think it might have been 10 to 15 people in the group. And then they did direct training. So they focused a lot on values training, so identifying your values. And then also they did mindfulness activities in those sessions. So like for instance, they did some of the classic ones like flashcards with different values and pulling out your values from the cards. They did some of the activities like the bus one, where you're the driver of the bus and you have a lot of different people on the bus who are giving you ideas about what they think you should and shouldn't do, but ultimately you're the driver of the bus. So they went through those sorts of activities. And then they practiced them directly in that group setting. And so they made sure they actually acted with the act behavior, and then also were able to reinforce it with the instructors there, telling them, like, yeah, you did it. Good job. So this was a shorter intervention. It went over 4 weeks instead of 5. And also it had a much later follow-up, so 14 weeks for maintenance. So the Prudenzi study seems to have a little bit more validity because of that, but it also kind of found pretty similar results, and they gave us a graph, which I like a lot. There was a significant reduction in psychological distress based on the GHQ metric that they used for it. Once again, group study, not using single subject design, so they used test score differences to measure everything. But they found distinct drop in psychological distress and in cognitive weariness as one of the components in the burnout assessment tool. There was no effect on work-related worry, rumination, implementation of safety practices, or physical and emotional burnout, which is interesting. I definitely like to know what made that different, but I think possibly we'll see because they focused specifically on values and doing mindfulness exercises. So possibly it was a less comprehensive look at the Hexaflex. So let's take a look at that now. So incorporating those ACT principles, how did they do? Well, the Liu et al. Study focused on the full Hexaflex. Like I said, they cited our course textbook, the Harris book, as content for their study. Also, In this one, they had limited support for mindfulness, so they didn't really emphasize mindfulness. They didn't really require any practice, and there was no direct reinforcement for practicing. So it's really interesting because the Liu et al. Study really just focused more on like an educational component and teaching like, here's how you could look at the world through this acceptance and commitment therapy lens. And it was primarily education-based, whereas the Prudenzi approach focused in a way on a more limited set of targets. They mostly focused on working on values and then practicing mindfulness exercises. They didn't necessarily hit the whole Hexaflex in their 4-week training, but they did directly practice it and then reinforced effective practice. So it's sort of like the Liu et al. Approach was more educational and comprehensive, but Prudenzi et al. Was more focused and action-oriented and sort of practice-based. Between the two, they both had pretty similar results. Depression and anxiety was the one target for Liu et al. That went down. Prudenzi et al. Had reductions in, what do they call it? I'm going to click back real quick. Psychological distress was the name of their metric. But it's interesting that both of these studies seem to only hit some targets. So to synthesize some conclusions on that, it tells me that a 4-week course could probably be helpful, or a 5-week course. They're both 4 or 5 weeks, sure. A 4 to 5 week course on ACT is probably going to be helpful. It'll probably really help, especially with depression and distress and anxiety. I think it would be really interesting to compare whether it would be more important to practice ACT or understand the ACT principles. I'm not sure which would be better, and both seem to be effective. So I guess you could say if someone understands the principles, they may practice them. And if you're going to practice them, you probably need to understand them to a degree. But it also, too, it looks like the full Hexaflex wasn't necessarily that, like it wasn't required to cover the full Hexaflex necessarily to get the benefits. Just getting values, focusing on values with some mindfulness techniques really seem to be enough. And it makes me think, and I'll probably need more research to really lock this down, but perhaps the values component and acting towards values may be one of the most important components of the Hexaflex. So I'm not sure. I definitely want to know more before I could commit to that idea, but it seems interesting at the very least. Well, anyways, thanks for joining me. It was great to have you here with me. If you're in my live stream audience, please leave a chat. If you're watching later, like the video. This is just my personal YouTube, so I don't care if you subscribe or not, but occasionally I do drop more videos about psychology as I go through the requirements for my school assignments. So thanks for joining me today. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.